"Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them." The command cut through the humid night air like a blade, sharp and controlled, the kind of voice that didn't expect to be questioned, only obeyed. Naomi Brooks didn't flinch. Not when the cruiser's red and blue lights painted the sidewalk in broken color. Not when the small crowd at the bus stop went quiet. And not even when the officer stepped closer, his boots heavy against the damp concrete. She had just come off a 12-hour shift at Mercy General, her scrubs faintly carrying the clean, sterile scent of antiseptic and latex, her shoulders aching in the way only long nights and longer silences could carve into a body. Her phone was still in her hand, screen dimming, a message half-typed to someone she hadn't replied to in weeks. She slowly lowered it, her movements careful, measured, like someone used to being watched more than heard. Officer Ryan Keller studied her with narrowed eyes, one hand resting near his radio, the other gesturing again, sharper this time, as if repetition alone could establish control. I said hands up. Around them, the world seemed to shrink. A car idled at the intersection, its engine humming low. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and stopped, as if even it understood something had shifted. Naomi raised her hands slightly, not high, just enough to show she wasn't a threat, her fingers steady despite the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The light caught her face at an angle, highlighting the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the quiet resilience in the set of her jaw. She didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She had learned long ago that sometimes the question mattered less than the answer you were already being forced into. Ryan took another step forward, closer now, close enough to see the hospital badge clipped at her waist, the name printed clearly, Naomi Brooks. His gaze lingered for half a second, then moved on like it meant nothing. "You match a description," he said, his tone flat, rehearsed, a line he'd used before, maybe too many times to count. Naomi's lips parted slightly, not in protest, but in something quieter, something heavier. "Of what?" she asked. Her voice calm, almost too calm, like still water before a storm you couldn't see yet. The question hung there, unanswered. Ryan didn't respond right away. Instead, he circled slightly, shifting his angle, positioning himself the way he'd been trained, the way that made him feel in control. The body cam on his chest blinked a small red light, recording everything, capturing every breath, every hesitation, every second that stretched longer than it should. Naomi noticed it. She always noticed things like that. Details mattered. They told stories people didn't always intend to tell. A breeze moved through the street, carrying the faint smell of rain and asphalt, brushing against her arms, raising a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Someone in the crowd shifted their weight. Another person whispered something too low to catch. No one stepped forward. No one intervened. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of history, of moments like this repeating themselves in different places with different names, but the same outcome hanging in the balance. Ryan's jaw tightened. There was something about her stillness that unsettled him, something about the way she held herself, not defiant, not submissive, just present, like she wasn't going to disappear to make this easier for him. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, but the edge in his voice suggested it already was. Naomi's eyes met his then, directly, without hesitation. There was no fear in them, not the kind he expected, not the kind that usually followed a command like his. Instead, there was something else. Clarity. The kind that came from knowing exactly where you stood, even when the ground beneath you wasn't stable. Her hands remained raised, her posture steady, her breathing slow and controlled. And then she spoke, her voice low but unmistakably firm, cutting through the tension without raising its volume. "You don't know what you're doing." The words didn't sound like a challenge. They sounded like a warning. For a brief second, something flickered across Ryan's face, something small, almost imperceptible, like doubt trying to surface before being pushed back down. The lights continued to flash, red to blue, blue to red, reflecting off the windows, the pavement, the metal of the cruiser, turning the entire scene into something unreal, like a moment suspended outside of time. Naomi didn't move. She didn't lower her hands. She didn't look away. And in that stillness, in that quiet refusal to break, something invisible shifted, something neither of them could fully see yet, but both were about to feel. Ryan Keller held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. like he was trying to read something written beneath the surface of her face, something that did not match the situation he thought he understood. But the moment passed, and the training took over again. The familiar structure of command and response settling back into place as he shifted his weight and exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, the way he had been taught to steady himself under pressure. Except this did not feel like pressure. It felt like resistance, quiet but undeniable, and he did not like that feeling. Not here, not in front of witnesses, not with the body camera blinking steadily on his chest recording every second of hesitation. "Turn around," he said, the words coming out firmer this time. Less room for interpretation, more force behind them even without raising his voice. And for a brief second it seemed like the world leaned in to see what she would do next. Naomi did not move right away, her hands still slightly raised, her breathing even, her eyes never leaving his. And in that stillness there was something grounding, something that made the moment stretch longer than it should have, until finally she spoke again, softer now, but somehow clearer. "Officer, I just got off a 12-hour shift at Mercy General. I have done nothing wrong." Her voice did not shake, did not rise. It carried the weight of fact, not defense. And that distinction hung in the air between them like a line. Neither of them had crossed yet. Somewhere behind Ryan, his radio crackled with static and a voice too distorted to make out clearly, a reminder that the world beyond this small circle was still moving, still operating on schedules and calls and codes. But here time felt slower, heavier, as if each second had to push through something unseen just to pass. Ryan glanced briefly at her badge again, the name catching the light for half a heartbeat, Naomi Brooks, and something about the way she said nothing more, offered nothing extra, unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. Most people filled silence with excuses or fear or anger. She filled it with presence, and that made it harder to define her, harder to fit her into the box he had already decided she belonged in. A car drove past slowly, the driver craning their neck just enough to take in the scene before moving on, the reflection of the cruiser lights sliding across the windshield like a warning that did not belong to anyone in particular. "You can explain that later," Ryan said, though there was a slight hesitation before the last word, like he was choosing it carefully. And then he stepped closer, close enough now to hear the faint rhythm of her breath, steady, controlled, deliberate, not the rhythm of someone panicking, not the rhythm of someone hiding anything. And that inconsistency pressed quietly against his instincts. Naomi lowered her hands just an inch, not enough to defy, just enough to ease the tension in her shoulders. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not defiance, not fear, something older, something that had been tested before. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be," she said, and there was no accusation in it, just a statement that landed heavier than if she had raised her voice. And for a fraction of a second Ryan felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger exactly. Not yet. Something closer to discomfort. The kind that comes when a situation refuses to follow the script you expect. The body camera continued its silent recording, capturing the angle of his stance, the distance between them, the tone of his voice, the stillness of hers. Every detail preserved without interpretation, waiting for someone else to decide what it meant later. A faint breeze moved through again, lifting a strand of Naomi's hair across her cheek before settling, and she did not brush it away, her focus never breaking, her posture unchanged, as if she had decided long before this moment exactly how she would stand in it. Ryan shifted again, a subtle movement, but enough to reveal the tension building beneath the surface, his hand hovering briefly near his belt before dropping back to his side. A gesture so small most people would not notice, but Naomi did, her eyes flicking down for just an instant before returning to his. Not reactive, just aware, always aware. "Last warning," he said, though it did not sound like a warning as much as it sounded like something he needed to say to maintain control of the narrative, to keep the scene aligned with what he understood, because if it drifted too far from that, he would have to question something deeper than procedure, and that was not a place he was prepared to go. Naomi inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that filled the lungs completely before being released just as evenly. And then she spoke one more time, her voice steady, quiet, but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over everything around them. "Then listen carefully," she said, and for the first time, Ryan did not immediately respond, the space between her words and his reaction stretching just long enough for something unseen to shift again, subtle but real, like the beginning of a crack forming beneath a surface that had always seemed solid. "You are already too close," she said quietly, her voice steady in a way that did not belong to fear. And for a fraction of a second Ryan Keller felt something shift beneath the surface of the moment, something subtle but real, like the ground was no longer as firm as it had been just seconds before. The red and blue lights pulsed across her face, across his uniform, across the wet pavement that mirrored everything in broken reflections, and the small crowd behind them had gone completely still, not moving, not speaking, just watching as if they already sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. Ryan stepped forward again, closing the last inch of distance, his voice tightening, sharper now, more controlled than calm. "Turn around. Now." And the command carried weight, but not certainty, not anymore. Naomi Brooks did not move. Immediately, her shoulders remained relaxed, her posture grounded, her eyes locked on his without challenge, without submission, just clarity, and that clarity pressed against him harder than resistance ever could. "I am not a threat," she said, soft, measured, undeniable, and the words did not rise, did not push. They simply landed, and in that landing something inside Ryan reacted before he could think it through. His hand moved. It was not planned, not calculated, not driven by anger, but by something quicker, something instinctive, something that tried to force the moment back into something he understood, something he could control, and in that fraction of a second his hand made brief contact with her face, not with force, not meant to injure, but enough to break the invisible line that had held everything together until that point. The sound was small, almost nothing, just a sharp interruption in the air, but the silence after it was not. For a split second, even he did not expect it. Not like that. Not here. Not in front of everyone. His hand lingered midair for a breath too long before dropping back to his side, and in that pause something inside him tightened, not fully formed, not yet regret, but close enough to feel. Behind him, a breath caught. Someone whispered, barely audible, "Did you see that?" A phone lifted, slower this time, more deliberate. The red light on his chest blinked, steady, unblinking, watching, remembering. Naomi's head had shifted, slightly with the contact, just enough to register it. But she did not step back, did not flinch, did not raise her voice. Instead, she turned her face back toward him slowly, her eyes finding his again, and there was no fear in them, none of the reaction he had unconsciously expected, only something deeper, something that made the space between them heavier than before. She inhaled, slow and controlled, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but it carried more weight, not less. "You just showed them who you are," she said, and the words did not accuse, did not escalate. They defined. They anchored the moment in a way that could not be undone. Ryan felt his jaw tighten, his instincts searching for something to say, something to reclaim control, but the words did not come the way they usually did, because something had shifted, not just in the situation, but in him. The rain continued to fall lightly, catching in her hair, tracing along her skin, but she did not move to wipe it away, her posture still steady, still grounded, as if the moment had not broken her, only revealed something that had always been there. "Turn around," Ryan repeated, but the command came out. Different this time, less sharp, less certain, like it was holding on to something that was already slipping. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in recognition. "You are not seeing me," she said, and that sentence landed deeper than anything else, because it did not challenge his authority, it exposed his perception. The words stayed in the air between them, heavy, unmoving, and for the first time since the encounter began, Ryan felt the structure of the moment shift beyond his control, beyond procedure, into something else entirely, something that could not be corrected by another command or contained by another step forward. The cruiser lights continued their rhythm, red to blue, blue to red, washing over both of them in alternating color, and in that shifting light the scene felt suspended again, but not the same as before. This time it felt like a line had been crossed, quietly, irreversibly, and neither of them could step back from it now, only forward into Whatever came next. Ryan Keller felt the weight of her last sentence linger longer than it should have, like it had settled somewhere deeper than sound, somewhere that could not be ignored no matter how much he tried to reframe the moment in his own mind. And for the first time since he stepped out of the cruiser, he hesitated not because he lacked authority, but because he was no longer certain how that authority fit into what was unfolding in front of him. His eyes shifted briefly past Naomi, scanning the small crowd again, noticing how still they had become, how no one was speaking, no one was moving, as if they were all waiting for something unseen to resolve, and that awareness pressed quietly against him, reminding him that this was no longer a simple interaction. It had become something observed, something that would not just disappear when the lights turned off. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her hands now resting naturally at her sides, her breathing steady, and there was something about the way she stood there that made the space feel different, less like a confrontation and more like a moment of decision. Though the decision itself had not yet been made, a faint rumble of thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, low and distant, and the air carried a hint of rain that had not yet fallen, the kind of atmosphere that made everything feel suspended, waiting. Ryan cleared his throat slightly, the sound subtle but noticeable in the quiet. And then he spoke again, his voice measured, controlled, but no longer as sharp as before. "You are being detained until I can verify your information," he said, and the words were technically correct, aligned with procedure, but even as he said them, they felt like they were filling space rather than defining it. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement, and her eyes did not leave his. "Then verify it," she replied, calm and direct, as if the solution had always been that simple, and her tone carried no resistance, only clarity. And that clarity forced Ryan into a position where he had to act on something real rather than assumption. He reached for his radio, his fingers brushing against it before pausing for half a second, that same hesitation surfacing again, smaller this time, but still present. Before he pressed the button, the static cracking to life under his touch. "Dispatch. This is Keller. I need to check on a Naomi Brooks, possible match to a call," he said, his voice returning to its professional cadence, the structure of protocol giving him something to hold on to, something predictable. The response came back through the speaker, faint at first, then clearer, a voice confirming receipt of the request, the sound grounding the moment just enough to keep it from drifting too far into uncertainty. Naomi watched him without interruption, her expression neutral, but her presence unwavering. And there was something about the way she allowed the process to unfold that shifted the dynamic subtly. She was not resisting, not complying out of fear, but participating with awareness, and that difference made the situation feel less like control and more like exposure. A light drizzle began to fall, soft at first, barely noticeable as it touched the pavement, creating small dark spots that spread slowly, and the reflections of the cruiser lights shimmered across the wet surface, turning the ground into a moving canvas of red and blue. Ryan lowered the radio slightly, waiting for the response, his eyes flicking back to Naomi. And for a brief second, he noticed something he had missed before, the faint indentation of a watch mark on her wrist, the kind that comes from wearing something consistently, the small details of a life lived with structure, responsibility, routine. And that observation did not align with the narrative he had built. In his mind, just minutes ago, the dispatcher's voice returned, clearer this time, "Stand by," followed by a pause that stretched just long enough to feel significant. And in that pause, the space between them seemed to tighten again, not with tension, but with anticipation, as if something was about to shift in a way neither of them could fully predict. Naomi took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling gently, her gaze still steady. And then she spoke once more, softer now, almost reflective. "You see how quickly things can change when you stop assuming." And the words were not directed as an accusation, but as an observation, something offered rather than imposed, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to push aside. Ryan did not respond immediately. His focus split between her and the radio in his hand, between the moment he was in and the information that was about to arrive. And for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, The kind that comes when the ground beneath a situation begins to reveal layers you had not accounted for. The rain picked up slightly, a soft patter against the cruiser, against the pavement, against everything. And in that quiet rhythm, the scene held its breath, waiting for the next piece to fall into place, the next truth to surface, the next decision to define what this moment would become. The rain had slowed to a faint mist that barely touched the ground, leaving the street coated in a thin, reflective sheen that stretched beneath the dim glow of the cruiser lights. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the night itself was holding its breath. Ryan Keller stood there, the distance between him and Naomi Brooks no longer charged in the same way, but not neutral either. Something heavier lingering in the space that neither of them acknowledged out loud. The radio at his shoulder crackled faintly with distant chatter, other units, other calls, a world continuing as if this moment had not carved itself into something permanent. But he did not respond, did not move immediately, his attention still fixed on her as the last of the tension settled into silence. Naomi adjusted her stance slightly, not in reaction, not in retreat, just enough to shift her weight before turning to leave. Her movement unhurried, unforced, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment. Long before her body followed, Ryan stepped back first, not protocol, just instinct, like the space between them suddenly mattered in a way it had not seconds before. The motion was small, almost unnoticeable, but it changed the shape of the scene, the invisible line between them widening just enough to let the moment breathe. Naomi did not look back right away, her steps steady against the damp pavement, each one quiet, measured, carrying none of the urgency the situation had tried to impose on her. The crowd began to shift slowly, tension dissolving into murmurs, a few lowered phones, glances exchanged without words, but Ryan barely registered them, his focus still anchored to her as she moved further down the street. He watched her walk away, longer than he should have, longer than procedure allowed, like something in that moment had not finished with him yet. The cruiser lights continued their steady rhythm, red to blue, blue to red, reflecting off her figure as it grew smaller in the distance, and for a second, the scene felt unreal, like something he had not fully stepped out of yet. His hand flexed slightly, the same one, the movement subtle, almost unconscious, fingers tightening before releasing again. He lowered it slowly, not with intention, but with awareness, like it did not belong where it had been, like it carried something he could not set down just by letting it fall to his side. The radio crackled again, louder this time, pulling at his attention, but he did not answer right away, the sound blending into the quiet around him as he stood there, caught between what had happened and what came next. A car passed in the distance, tires cutting through the damp road with a soft hiss, the sound grounding the moment just enough to remind him that the night had not stopped, even if something inside him had. He turned slightly, his gaze breaking from Naomi's fading silhouette. And for the first time since the encounter began, the street looked different, not because anything had changed, but because something in him had shifted, something small but undeniable. He reached for the radio finally, pressing the button with a steadiness that felt practiced, automatic. Unit 12, he said, his voice controlled. Even, situation is resolved. The pause barely noticeable, but present, carrying something unspoken between the words. Copy that. Dispatch responded, routine, neutral, and the line closed as quickly as it had opened. Leaving him alone again in the quiet aftermath, Ryan exhaled slowly, the breath deeper than it needed to be, and as he turned toward the cruiser, his steps were measured, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, just aware. The door opened with a soft click, and he paused for a second before getting in, his hand resting briefly against the frame, the cool metal grounding him in the present moment. When he finally sat down, the interior felt smaller than before, the familiar space carrying a weight that had not been there earlier, and he rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel, not gripping, not tense, just there. The red light from the dashboard reflected faintly across his fingers, steady, constant, and for a moment he looked at them, not searching for anything, just noticing, as if they belonged to someone he had not fully recognized until now. Outside, the mist continued to drift through the air, the streetlights casting soft halos that blurred at the edges, and the space Naomi had occupied moments before was now empty. but not erased, the imprint of it still present in ways he could not name. The engine idled quietly beneath him, a low hum that filled the silence without breaking it, and as he sat there, unmoving, the night continued around him, steady, indifferent, carrying everything forward, even the parts that did not feel ready to move yet. Ryan Keller did not move right away after the confirmation came through the radio, and that stillness felt louder than any command he had given before, like the moment itself was waiting on him to decide what kind of man he was going to be next, not just what kind of officer. And the distinction pressed against him in a way that felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore. The rain continued to fall, steady now, soaking into the fabric of his uniform, darkening it in patches that spread slowly, and he barely noticed. His focus fixed on Naomi Brooks, who stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her presence grounded in a way that made everything else feel less certain. The second officer, still standing a few yards behind, shifted his stance slightly, his boots scraping softly against the wet pavement, and he glanced toward Ryan as if waiting for direction, for a signal that would define how this situation would resolve, but Ryan did not give one. Not yet, because for the first time, the script he usually followed had run out, and what came next was not written in procedure. Naomi's words from moments ago lingered, not as an accusation, but as something heavier, something that had settled into the space between them and refused to dissipate. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that same quiet steadiness, that same clarity that had been there from the beginning. "You verified it," she said, not as a question, but as a simple acknowledgement, and the way she said it made it clear that the confirmation had not changed who she was. It had only revealed what had always been true. Ryan inhaled slowly, the breath deeper than he intended, and when he exhaled, it felt like something inside him had shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make him aware of it, enough to make him realize that the moment had moved beyond control and into something else entirely, something that required a different kind of response. "You are free to go," he said finally, the words measured, deliberate, and though they were simple, they carried a weight that extended beyond their meaning, because they were not just about her, they were about him, about the recognition of a mistake that had already been made, even if it had not been fully addressed yet. Naomi did not move immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, carried its own significance, as if she was allowing the words to settle, allowing the moment to complete itself before taking the next step. And then she nodded once, a small, controlled motion, her gaze still steady on his, not triumphant, not relieved, just present, as it had been from the start. "I was never not free," she said quietly, and the sentence landed with a weight that went beyond its simplicity, because it reframed everything that had just happened, shifting the perspective from authority granted to dignity maintained. And in that shift, something inside Ryan tightened again, not in resistance this time, but in recognition. The second officer glanced between them, his expression neutral but attentive, sensing that something had passed between them that was not visible on the surface, something that would not be captured fully by the blinking light of a camera or the static of a radio call. And he remained where he was, silent, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, a small, practical movement, and then she took a step back, not in retreat, but in transition, as if she was stepping out of a space that no longer held her. And the rain continued to fall around her, soft but steady, catching the light as she moved. Ryan watched her, his eyes following her movement, and for a brief second, he considered saying something more, something that would address what had happened, something that would acknowledge the imbalance, the assumption, the moment that had crossed a line he had not fully seen until now. But the words did not come easily, not because they were not there, but because they required something he had not yet fully formed. Naomi paused just long enough to turn her head slightly, not fully facing him, but enough that her voice carried clearly back to where he stood. "Next time, do not wait for confirmation to see what is already in front of you," she said, and the sentence was not sharp, not accusatory. It was steady, grounded, offered without force, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to push aside. Ryan did not respond, not immediately, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had just occurred. Every assumption, every hesitation, every shift in understanding that had taken place in the span of a few minutes. And in that silence, he felt the weight of it settle, not as something external, but as something internal, something that would not simply fade when the scene ended. Naomi turned forward again and began to walk, her steps steady, unhurried, her figure moving through the rain and the shifting lights until she was no longer at the center of the moment, no longer the focus of the scene. And yet somehow, her presence remained, lingering in the space she left behind. Ryan stood where he was, the rain continuing to fall around him, the radio quiet now, the second officer still waiting. And for the first time that night, he did not feel in control of the moment, but he did feel aware of it, fully, completely, and that awareness settled into him in a way that felt unfamiliar, but real, like the beginning of something he could not yet name, but would not be able to ignore. Naomi Brooks did not look back again after her final words, her steps carrying her forward with the same steady rhythm she had held from the beginning, each footfall soft against the rain-slick pavement, measured, unhurried, as if she had already left the moment behind even, while still physically within it. And the distance between her and Ryan Keller grew slowly, not dramatic, not sudden, just enough to make the space feel wider, emptier, like something important had passed through it and left its imprint behind. Ryan remained where he stood, his posture still, his eyes following her silhouette as it moved through the shifting red and blue reflections. And for the first time that night, he was not scanning for threat, not assessing control. He was watching, truly, watching. The way her shoulders remained relaxed despite everything, the way her pace did not change, the way she carried herself with a quiet certainty that did not rely on anyone else's approval. And that observation pressed against something inside him that he had not examined in a long time. The second officer stepped closer now, closing the gap between them by a few feet, his presence no longer just observational, but engaged. And he glanced toward Ryan with a subtle tilt of his head, the kind of unspoken question that did not need words. But Ryan did not answer right away, his focus still on Naomi as she reached the edge of the block, her figure partially obscured by the rain and the dim streetlights, until finally the other officer spoke, his voice low, neutral. "Everything good here?" And the question hung in the air, simple on the surface but layered beneath, because it was not just about the situation. It was about the choices that had just been made within it. Ryan blinked once, as if returning to the present, and then he nodded, the motion small but deliberate. "Yeah," he said, though the word felt incomplete even as he said it, lacking the certainty it usually carried. And the other officer studied him for a second longer, sensing the difference without pushing further, before glancing back down the street where Naomi had now almost disappeared from view. The rain softened slightly, the steady rhythm easing into something lighter, and the flashing lights from the cruiser reflected differently now, less chaotic, more subdued, as if the intensity of the moment had begun to settle, leaving behind a quieter aftermath. Ryan exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, and when he did, it felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just air, like it carried the weight of realization that had not fully formed yet, but was beginning to take shape. His hand moved almost instinctively to the body camera on his chest, his fingers brushing against the edge of it, not turning it off, just acknowledging its presence. And for the first time, he wondered not what it had captured, but how it would be seen, not just by supervisors or departments, but by anyone who watched it without context, without assumption, just the raw sequence of events as they had unfolded. The other officer shifted again, glancing back toward Ryan. "You want me to log it, or you got it?" he asked, practical, routine, offering structure where it was needed, and Ryan hesitated for half a second before answering. "I will handle it," he said, his voice steadier now, but different, less automatic, more intentional, as if the act of taking responsibility required a different kind of grounding than he was used to. The other officer nodded once, accepting the answer without question, and stepped back slightly, giving Ryan space again, the unspoken understanding between them settling into place. Ryan turned his gaze back to the street, but Naomi was no longer visible, her presence reduced now to memory, to the echo of her words, to the imprint she had left on the moment. And in that absence, the space felt larger, quieter, like something had shifted that could not be reversed. He replayed her last sentence in his mind, not as a sound, but as a realization. Do not wait for confirmation to see what is already in front of you. And the more he turned it over, the more it expanded, reaching beyond the moment itself, beyond the specific interaction, into something broader, something that touched the way he had approached countless situations before without questioning them. The rain continued to fall lightly, tapping against the pavement, the cruiser, the quiet space between thoughts, and Ryan stood there, not moving, not speaking, just allowing the moment to settle fully, to land in a way that could not be dismissed or minimized. After a few seconds, he finally turned toward the cruiser, his steps slower than before, more deliberate, as if each movement required a level of awareness that had not been there earlier. And when he reached the door, he paused again, his hand resting on the handle, his reflection faintly visible in the rain-streaked window, distorted slightly by the water and the flashing lights. And for a brief second, he did not recognize the expression looking back at him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was unguarded, stripped of the certainty he usually carried, replaced with something quieter, something more honest. He opened the door slowly, the sound muted by the rain, and as he slid into the driver's seat, the interior of the cruiser felt different, smaller somehow, like the space itself had shifted along with him, and the radio remained silent for a moment. The absence of noise almost noticeable after everything that had just occurred. Ryan sat there, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not starting the engine, not reaching for the radio, just sitting. And in that stillness, the weight of the moment settled fully, not as a burden, but as something else, something that demanded attention, demanded reflection, and for the first time in a long time, he did not push it away. The cruiser engine finally turned over with a low, steady rumble, the sound filling the quiet interior as Ryan Keller sat behind the wheel, his hands still resting where they had been, not gripping, not tense, just there, as if he was not fully ready to move yet, even though the machine beneath him had already decided to. Outside, the rain had softened into a fine mist, barely visible now except where it caught the glow of the streetlights, turning the air itself into something reflective, something that held light instead of letting it pass through. And for a moment, the entire street looked suspended, like a photograph that had not yet been developed. Ryan stared ahead through the windshield, the wipers moving in slow, rhythmic arcs, clearing just enough to keep the road visible, but never fully erasing the water that kept returning. And there was something about that repetition that matched the way his thoughts were moving, circling back, replaying, not letting go. He reached up and turned off the flashing lights, the red and blue fading into a single steady glow from the dashboard. And with that shift, the scene outside changed instantly, no longer a spectacle, no longer something drawing attention, just a quiet street again, empty except for the lingering dampness and the faint echo of what had just happened. The radio crackled softly, a routine call. Passing through, another unit responding somewhere else, another situation unfolding that had nothing to do with him. And for the first time, he did not reach for it immediately. He let it pass. Let the world continue without his interruption for just a moment longer. His fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel, not out of impatience, but out of thought, a subtle rhythm that matched the quiet tension still settling in his chest. And then he leaned back slightly, his shoulders pressing into the seat as he exhaled slowly, the breath longer than it needed to be, like he was trying to release something that had not yet fully formed. Naomi's voice returned again, not as sound, but as memory, clear and steady, and it did not carry emotion the way he expected. It carried certainty, the kind that did not need to raise itself to be heard. And that was what unsettled him the most. Not what she said, but how she said it, as if she had already understood something he was just beginning to see. He reached down and picked up the small notepad resting in the center console, flipping it open without fully realizing why, his pen hovering above the page for a second before he began to write. Not a report, not yet, just fragments, words that came without structure, verified identity. He wrote first, then paused, the pen lingering, before adding, "No escalation," and then another pause, longer this time, before he wrote a final line, slower, more deliberate. "Initial assumption, incorrect," And as he stared at the words, they felt insufficient, too small to capture the weight of what had actually occurred. But they were a start, a place to hold on as something real, outside the cruiser. The second officer moved back toward his own vehicle, the sound of his door opening and closing muffled by the damp air, and soon after, his headlights shifted, turning away, leaving Ryan alone again on the street, the space quieter now, more contained. Ryan closed the notepad slowly, placing it back where he had found it, and for a moment he simply sat there, listening to the engine, to the faint patter of rain, to the distant hum of a city that never fully stopped, even in moments like this. His hand moved again to the body camera, his thumb brushing against the edge before pressing the button. The small click barely audible, but the significance of it felt larger, not because the recording had ended, but because the moment it captured was now fixed, unchangeable, something that could be reviewed, replayed, examined from angles he had not considered in real time. He started to pull away from the curb, the cruiser moving slowly at first, tires rolling over the wet pavement with a soft, steady sound. And as he turned onto the next street, the world resumed its normal pace around him. Cars passing, lights changing, people moving through their routines without knowing what had just unfolded a block away, without knowing how something so small on the surface could shift something much larger beneath it. At the next intersection, he stopped at a red light, the glow reflecting off the windshield, and for a moment, he just watched it, the stillness of the stop contrasting with the motion that had just begun again. And in that pause, something settled more clearly than before, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet understanding that would not fade with distance or time. The light turned green, but he did not move right away, just a second longer than necessary. And then he pressed the accelerator gently, the cruiser continuing forward, carrying him into the rest of his shift, into the rest of the night, but not away from what had just happened, because that was not something distance could resolve. It was something that would follow him, something that had already begun to change the way he saw the road ahead. The rain had softened into a thin mist that clung to the air, barely visible except when it caught the flashing lights. And everything about the street felt quieter now, not because the tension was gone, but because it had settled into something heavier, something that did not need noise to exist. Ryan Keller stood there, the distance between him and Naomi Brooks unchanged, but the space itself felt different, like it carried the weight of what had just happened and refused to let it fade. The red light on his chest continued its steady blink. Silent, constant, recording without judgment, without pause. His radio crackled suddenly, sharp enough to cut through the stillness, and for a moment he did not move, did not reach for it, as if the sound belonged to a different world, one that had not yet caught up to this moment. "Dispatch. This is Keller," he said finally, his voice lower than before, controlled, but not as certain. "I need a full ID verification on Naomi Brooks." And the words came out measured, procedural, something familiar to hold on to. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze no longer confrontational, but not withdrawn either, simply present, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment while still standing inside it. The response from dispatch came quickly at first, routine, expected, confirming receipt, but then there was a pause, a gap just long enough to be noticed, just long enough to feel different. Ryan's grip on the radio tightened slightly. "Stand by," the voice said, and the tone had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to register, enough to pull his attention fully back into the exchange. The mist hung in the air between breaths, the crowd behind him quieter now, no longer whispering, no longer moving, as if something unseen had pressed down over the entire scene. Another voice came through the radio, not the same dispatcher, not the same rhythm, sharper, more controlled. "Keller, confirms status of the subject." And Ryan frowned slightly, his eyes flicking toward Naomi before answering. "She is standing by," he said, the hesitation small, but real. There was another pause, longer this time. "Is the subject safe?" the voice asked, and the question landed differently than it should have. Not routine, not procedural, something else layered beneath it. Ryan straightened slightly, confusion pressing in. "Yes," he replied, more firmly this time. "Who is this?" The line remained quiet for a second too long, and in that silence something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Naomi did not react outwardly, but her presence felt steadier, more grounded, as if the moment was unfolding exactly the way it was meant to. Then the first dispatcher returned, voice slightly tighter now. Keller, stand by. And the repetition carried weight, as if it was not just instruction, but warning. The red light on his chest blinked again, steady, patient, and Ryan became suddenly aware of it, aware of the fact that everything happening now was being captured, preserved, seen later by eyes that were not here. The second voice cut in again, quieter this time, more deliberate. Her emergency contact has been flagged, and Ryan's brow tightened. Flagged how? He asked, the question coming out sharper than intended. Another pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to make you aware of your own breathing. Federal, the voice said simply. The word did not echo, did not rise. It just settled, heavy and precise. Ryan felt something shift in his chest, not fear, not yet, but recognition that the moment had moved beyond what he understood. Repeat that, he said, quieter now. Federal. The voice confirmed. You might want to step back. Behind him, someone shifted their weight, a shoe scraping softly against wet pavement. But no one spoke, no one interrupted, as if the entire street had become a witness to something larger than any of them. Ryan lowered the radio slightly, his eyes returning to Naomi, and for the first time since the encounter began, he did not see a situation to control. He saw something he had not accounted for, something that had been there the entire time without needing to reveal itself. Naomi met his gaze again, calm, unchanged, her expression not triumphant, not defensive, just certain, and that certainty carried more weight now than anything else in the moment. The mist drifted slowly between them, the cruiser lights continuing their steady rhythm. But the energy had shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, where it mattered most. Ryan's stance loosened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, the first small fracture in the structure he had been holding on to. You can still choose, Naomi said quietly, her voice cutting through the layered silence without force, and the words did not command, did not challenge. They offered something else, something that did not depend on authority. Ryan did not respond immediately, his eyes lingering on her, on the steadiness she carried without effort. And in that moment, the realization did not arrive all at once. It began, slow, quiet, unavoidable, like something rising beneath the surface that could no longer be ignored. The radio remained in his hand, silent now, but heavier than before, and the red light on his chest continued to blink, recording, remembering, as the moment stretched forward into whatever came next. The hallway door closed softly behind him, the faint click echoing for a second before dissolving into the quiet, and Ryan Keller stepped back into the open air with a slower pace than before, his boots meeting the damp concrete without urgency, without the sharp rhythm he had carried earlier in the night. And for a moment he just stood there, letting the cool air settle against his skin, letting the silence expand around him, not empty, but full of everything that had shifted inside him over the past hour. The apartment building behind him was still now, the flickering light above the entrance steadying into a consistent glow, as if even it had decided to stop wavering. And Ryan glanced up at it briefly before turning back toward his cruiser, the vehicle waiting at the curb exactly where he had left it, unchanged, familiar, but somehow not the same. He walked toward it slowly, his mind not racing, not searching for the next call or the next action, but turning inward, revisiting moments that had once passed without question, now resurfacing with a clarity that made them harder to ignore. The way he had spoken, the assumptions he had made, the subtle shifts he had not noticed until someone else had pointed them out without raising their voice. Naomi's presence remained with him, not as a memory he could set aside, but as something active, something that had altered the way he interpreted everything that followed. And as he reached the cruiser, he paused again, his hand resting briefly on the hood, the metal cool beneath his palm, grounding him in the present moment. He opened the door and sat inside. The interior quiet, the engine still running, a low steady hum that filled the space without demanding attention, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting to the dashboard, the soft glow of the instruments reflecting in the windshield, creating a faint double image of the world outside. The radio remained silent for a moment, and in that pause, he reached for the notepad again, flipping it open to the lines he had written earlier. The words still there, unchanged. Initial assumption incorrect. And he stared at them longer this time, not as a note, but as a statement that extended beyond the page, beyond the moment, into something broader, something that required more than acknowledgement. It required adjustment. His pen hovered above the paper again, and slowly, deliberately, he added another line beneath it, reevaluate approach. The letters forming carefully, as if the act of writing them carried its own weight. And when he finished, he did not close the notebook right away. He let it sit open, the words visible, something he could not simply tuck away. The radio crackled suddenly, breaking the quiet, a dispatcher's voice cutting through with a tone that was more urgent than the calls before. All units, be advised. Possible medical emergency reported near Eastbrook Avenue. Elderly male, unresponsive, caller unsure of condition. And Ryan's hand moved instinctively toward the microphone. But there was no hesitation this time, only clarity. Unit 12 responding, he said, his voice steady, focused, and he shifted the cruiser into gear, pulling away from the curb with a smooth, controlled motion. The streets ahead opened up, the traffic light at the next intersection turning green just as he approached, and he moved through it without needing to slow, the path ahead aligning in a way that felt almost deliberate. And as he drove, the earlier moment did not fade. It stayed with him, not as a distraction, but as a filter, shaping the way he approached what came next. He arrived at the location within minutes, the address marked by a small single-story home with a narrow driveway and a porch light that flickered faintly against the dark. And as he stepped out of the cruiser, the air felt heavier here, not from the weather, but from the urgency that lingered around the house. The front door partially open, a figure visible just inside. Ryan moved quickly but not rushed, his steps controlled, his presence focused, and as he reached the doorway, a woman turned toward him, her expression tight with concern, her voice catching slightly as she spoke. "He is not waking up," and Ryan nodded once, stepping inside without hesitation, his attention immediately shifting to the man seated in a chair near the living room, his posture slumped, his breathing shallow but present. Ryan approached carefully, his movements precise, and he knelt slightly, his voice calm as he addressed the woman. "When did this start?" he asked, and as she explained, her words uneven but clear, he listened fully, not interrupting, not assuming, allowing the information to form the situation instead of forcing it into a predetermined shape. And that difference, subtle but significant, guided his next actions. He reached for his radio, calling for medical support, his voice clear and direct, providing the necessary details without excess. And then he turned back to the man, checking his responsiveness, his focus steady, grounded in the present moment. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of breathing, the faint hum of a clock on the wall, and the distant echo of approaching sirens. And in that space, Ryan felt something settle into place. Not a resolution, not yet, but a direction, a way forward that did not rely on assumption, but on attention, on presence, on seeing what was actually there instead of what he expected to find. Outside, the sirens grew louder, closing the distance, and Ryan remained where he was, steady, focused, aware. The earlier moment no longer something behind him, but something within him, shaping every choice, every word, every action, as the night continued to unfold around him. The sound of the sirens grew louder until it filled the small living room completely, then softened again as the ambulance came to a stop just outside, its lights casting rhythmic flashes through the window, red and white this time, different from before, but still carrying that same sense of urgency that turned ordinary spaces into something else, something suspended between calm and crisis. Ryan Keller remained kneeling beside the elderly man, his focus steady, his movements precise but gentle, his hand positioned carefully as he monitored the man's breathing, counting the rhythm without looking at a clock, relying instead on instinct and presence. And the woman stood nearby, her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on Ryan as if he were the only stable point in the room. "They are almost here," Ryan said quietly, his voice calm, not rushed, not dramatic, just steady enough to hold the space together. And the woman nodded quickly, her breath uneven but beginning to match the slower pace he set without realizing it. The front door opened wider as the paramedics entered, their steps efficient, practiced, bringing with them the controlled urgency of people who had done this many times before, and Ryan shifted slightly to give them space, not stepping away entirely, but transitioning smoothly from primary action to support, his presence still grounded, still attentive. "What do we have?" one of the paramedics asked, and Ryan responded clearly, without assumption, without adding interpretation. "Male, approximately late 70s, unresponsive when we arrived, breathing shallow but consistent, no visible distress indicators, his voice steady, factual, leaving room for the professionals to assess without interference, and that difference, that restraint, shaped the way the room moved around him." The paramedics knelt beside the man, their hands moving quickly but carefully, checking vitals, speaking in short, focused phrases to each other, and Ryan stepped back just enough to allow their work to take full priority, his gaze shifting briefly to the woman, who now stood slightly closer to him, her shoulders still tense but her eyes less frantic, anchored by the presence of people who understood what to do next. "He is going to be okay, right?" she asked, her voice quiet but urgent, and Ryan met her gaze, not with certainty he could not promise, but with honesty that did not alarm. "They are taking care of him now," he said, his tone steady, and though the answer was not definitive, it carried enough grounding to give her something to hold on to. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving only the faint scent of wet pavement drifting in through the open doorway, mixing with the sterile smell of the medical equipment now filling the room, and the flashing lights continued to pulse softly against the walls, creating a rhythm that felt less chaotic than before, more contained, more purposeful. Ryan watched as the paramedics prepared to move the man onto a stretcher, their movements coordinated, efficient, and he noticed the small details again. The way one of them adjusted the blanket slightly to keep it from slipping. The way another spoke quietly to the man even though he had not responded. And those details, small as they were, carried something familiar, something that echoed the steadiness he had seen earlier, the quiet care that did not need recognition to exist. As they lifted the stretcher, the woman stepped closer, her hand hovering near the man's shoulder before resting lightly, her touch careful, her expression softening just enough to reveal the fear beneath it, and Ryan stepped slightly to the side, giving her space, not directing, not controlling, just allowing the moment to unfold as it needed to. "We will take him to Mercy General," one of the paramedics said, and Ryan caught the name immediately, the connection forming before he could stop it. The same hospital Naomi had mentioned, the same place she had just left hours before, and for a brief second, the night felt smaller, more connected, as if the lines between moments were not as separate as they seemed. The stretcher moved toward the door, the paramedics guiding it carefully through the narrow space, and the woman followed closely, her steps quick but controlled, her focus entirely on the man, and Ryan remained where he was for a second longer, watching them leave, the sound of their movement fading into the night as they reached the ambulance. The door remained open, the house now quieter than before, the urgency shifting outward, carried away by the flashing lights and the low hum of the engine starting up again, and Ryan stepped outside, the cool air meeting him again, grounding him as he watched the ambulance pull away slowly, the lights fading into the distance. He stood there for a moment, the street now returning to its normal rhythm, the quiet settling back in, and he felt something different in his chest, not relief exactly, not resolution, but alignment, like the way he had moved through this situation had matched something deeper than procedure, something that had been missing before. He glanced down at his hands briefly, noticing the faint dampness from the rain, the steadiness in them, and then he looked back toward the empty street, the space where the ambulance had just been, and for the first time that night, he did not feel like he was reacting to events. He felt like he was present within them, fully, completely, aware not just of what was happening, but how he was part of it. The radio crackled again softly, another call, another moment waiting somewhere else, and Ryan reached for it without hesitation. His voice calm, grounded. "Unit 12, ready," he said, and as the words left him, they carried a different kind of weight, not heavier, but clearer, like they were rooted in something that would not shift as easily as before, something that had already begun to change the way he moved through the world around him. The night settled into a quieter rhythm after the ambulance disappeared, the flashing lights fading into memory as the street returned to its ordinary stillness. And Ryan Keller stood beside his cruiser for a moment longer than necessary, not because there was nothing left to do, but because something inside him had shifted enough that moving forward without acknowledging it felt incomplete. The air carried a faint chill now, the earlier rain leaving behind a thin sheen on the pavement that reflected the streetlights in soft, uneven patterns, and as he looked down the empty road, he realized how different everything felt, not because the world had changed, but because his place in it had. He reached for the driver's door and paused again, his hand resting against the metal, and for a brief second, Naomi's voice returned with the same clarity it had carried before, not louder, not sharper, just present. And this time it did not feel like something external. It felt like something he had already begun to carry within him. He slid into the seat and closed the door, the sound muted but final, and as he adjusted his position, his eyes moved instinctively to the small digital clock on the dashboard, the numbers steady, unchanging, marking the passage of time that felt both continuous and altered at once. The radio remained quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Ryan reached up and touched the body camera again, not to turn it on or off, but to acknowledge its presence, the fact that everything he had done earlier still existed somewhere, recorded, fixed, waiting, and for the first time, he did not think about how it would be judged. He thought about how it would be understood. He started the cruiser again, the engine responding with a low hum, and as he pulled away from the curb, his movements were smoother, more deliberate, not rushed, not reactive. And as he turned onto the next street, he noticed something small but significant, the way he was looking at people differently, not scanning for patterns, not categorizing automatically, but observing, actually seeing, allowing the moment to present itself before deciding what it meant. A figure walked along the sidewalk ahead, a man in a dark jacket, his hands in his pockets, his head slightly lowered against the cool air, and Ryan slowed just slightly as he passed, not because there was suspicion, but because there was awareness, and that difference, subtle as it was, reshaped the interaction entirely, turning it from something defined by assumption into something grounded in presence. The man glanced up briefly, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second, and then he continued walking. Nothing more exchanged, nothing more needed. But even that small moment felt different, more intentional, more real. Ryan continued driving, the city unfolding around him in familiar patterns that now carried a new depth. And as he approached another intersection, he saw a group of people gathered near a corner store, their voices low, their movements casual, and instead of preparing for a confrontation, he simply observed, letting the situation exist without forcing it into a narrative it did not belong to. The light turned red, and he stopped, the cruiser idling quietly as he looked ahead, and for a moment, he thought about how many times he had moved through nights like this without ever pausing, without ever allowing space for reflection, and how easily those moments had passed, unnoticed, unexamined, until now. The light changed, and he moved forward again, the road opening up ahead, and the radio finally crackled to life with another call, routine, familiar, and this time he responded without hesitation, but with clarity. Unit 12 responding, his voice steady, grounded, not just in procedure, but in awareness. As he drove toward the next location, he realized that what had changed was not just how he reacted, but how he listened, how he saw, how he chose to engage, and that shift, though quiet, carried a weight that extended beyond the night, beyond the shift, into something that would follow him long after the cruiser was parked and the uniform set aside. He turned onto a quieter street, the houses lined evenly, their porch lights casting soft pools of light onto the sidewalks, and as he slowed near the address given, he noticed a small detail he might have missed before, a bicycle left leaning against a mailbox, slightly out of place, a sign of something paused, something incomplete, and instead of dismissing it, he registered it, not as a clue, not as a threat, but as part of the environment, part of the story unfolding in front of him. He parked the cruiser and stepped out, the air still carrying that faint trace of rain, and as he approached the house. His steps were steady, his posture open, his presence calm, and when he reached the door, he knocked gently, not forcefully, allowing space for a response. And when it came, a voice from inside, cautious but not alarmed, he spoke clearly. "Police department, just here to check on a call." And the tone carried something different now, something that did not demand control, but offered clarity. The door opened slowly, revealing a young man, his expression uncertain but not defensive, and Ryan met his gaze with the same steadiness he had learned to hold, not imposing, not assuming, just present. And as the conversation began, he listened fully, allowing the situation to reveal itself rather than forcing it into shape. And in that moment, the shift was complete, not as a dramatic transformation, but as a quiet alignment between who he was and how he chose to act. The night continued around him, the city moving as it always did, but for Ryan, every step, every word, every decision now carried a different weight, not heavier, but more intentional, more aware. And as he stood there, engaged in yet another moment that would have once passed without notice, he understood something clearly, not as a lesson, not as a rule, but as a truth that had already begun to take root within him, something that would not fade with time, because it had changed the way he saw everything that came after. The door remained open just long enough for the conversation to settle into something calm, something resolved without tension, and as Ryan Keller stepped back onto the quiet street, the night felt different in a way that could not be measured, only recognized, like a shift in weight that you only notice once it is no longer there. The young man closed the door gently behind him, the soft click echoing briefly before fading into the stillness. And Ryan stood for a moment on the sidewalk, his gaze drifting across the row of houses, each one lit by a porch light that cast small pools of warmth onto the damp ground, each one holding lives he would never fully know, stories he would never completely see. And yet for the first time, he felt the importance of that distance, not as a gap to control, but as a space to respect. The air had cleared now, the earlier rain leaving behind a cool clarity that made every sound sharper, every detail more defined. And as he walked back toward his cruiser, his steps steady and unhurried, he noticed the small things again, the faint creak of a sign shifting in the breeze, the distant hum of a passing car, the soft rustle of leaves against pavement, all of it part of a world that continued whether he was paying attention or not. And for the first time, he chose to pay attention. He reached the cruiser and paused, his hand resting briefly on the door, and for a second, the reflection in the window caught his eye again, not distorted this time, but clear, and he looked at it without turning away, not searching for something different, just acknowledging what was there. The same uniform, the same badge, but not the same certainty behind it. Something quieter now, something more aware. He opened the door and sat inside, the familiar interior settling around him, the soft glow of the dashboard lights illuminating the space. And he let the door close with a muted sound that felt more final than before, like the end of something that did not need to be named. The radio remained quiet, the city momentarily still, and in that silence, he reached for the notepad once more, flipping it open to the lines he had written earlier. The words unchanged but no longer incomplete, and after a brief pause, he added one more line beneath them, slower than the others, more deliberate. "See before you decide." And as he finished writing, he did not question it, did not edit it. He simply let it stand, a small statement that carried more weight than the space it occupied. He closed the notebook gently and set it aside, his hand lingering on it for a moment before returning to the steering wheel. And as he looked ahead through the windshield, the road stretched out in front of him, empty but full of possibility, each intersection a choice, each moment an opportunity to act differently, not because he had to, but because he now understood that he could. He started the engine again, the low hum filling the quiet space, and as he pulled away from the curb, the cruiser moved smoothly into the street, not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward with a steadiness that matched something deeper within him. The city lights passed by in soft patterns, reflections shifting across the glass, and as he drove, Naomi's presence returned one last time, not as a voice, not as a memory of words, but as a feeling, a quiet certainty that had not imposed itself, but revealed something already there, something he had not been looking for. until it was placed directly in front of him. He turned onto a wider road, the traffic light ahead glowing green, and he continued through it without slowing, the path clear, the night open, and for the first time since the beginning of his shift, there was no tension in his movement, no need to anticipate or control, just awareness, steady and grounded. The radio finally came to life again. Another call, another situation waiting somewhere in the distance, and he reached for it without hesitation, his voice calm, measured. Unit 12, go ahead. And as the dispatcher spoke, providing details, he listened fully, not just to respond, but to understand, allowing the moment to form before stepping into it. The cruiser moved through the city with quiet purpose, the streets unfolding ahead, and Ryan remained present in each second, not as someone reacting to the world, but as someone moving within it with intention, aware of the weight of each decision, each word, each action. And somewhere behind him, unnoticed by the rest of the city, a moment had already passed, a quiet exchange on a rain-soaked street that did not make headlines, did not draw attention, but changed something that would ripple forward in ways no one else would see. And as the night continued, as the calls came and went, as the city moved in its endless rhythm, Ryan carried that moment with him, not as a burden, but as a compass, something small and steady that would guide him long after the lights faded and the shift came to an end, because he had not just witnessed something that night, he had been changed by it, and that change, quiet as it was enough.